Crimson Peak is a 2015 film directed by Guillermo del Toro that stars Mia Wasikowska as the protagonist Edith Cushing. Set between Victorian England and Buffalo, New York, the film follows the aspiring young author as she moves to the isolated mansion of her new husband and his sister. As time progresses, Edith finds herself becoming sicker and sicker from a mysterious illness, and learns that her husband is not all who he says he is, and that ghosts are far beyond the reaches of just old stories. Crimson Peak was marketed as a supernatural horror film to audiences, as seen in the tone of this trailer. It has a lot of common traits of other horror film trailers, such as jump scares, quick editing, and intense music stings to accentuate scares, including use of electric guitar, which actually isn't present in the film's soundtrack. Here, the ghosts are framed as the antagonists of the film when they aren't in the actual story. Though the trailers may lead you to believe it's different, the true genre of Crimson Peak is gothic romance. There are a couple of reasons why marketing decided to turn towards this idea that it was actually a supernatural horror film, one of those likely being that gothic romance as a genre has an incredibly small audience, and the film boasts a budget of $50 million US. That means that in order to turn a profit, which is to make back the amount of money that it uses as a budget and then some, they would have to market towards a much wider audience, such as the audience that enjoys horror films. The budget of this film is incredibly high, for movies in general, but also for just horror films. Most horror films that came out within 2014 to 2016, and even now, generally have an incredibly small budget in comparison to what Crimson Peak had. For example, just a year before, two films were released that had incredibly small budgets and incredibly high returns. One of those is Unfriended, which had a budget of $1 million US and made a turnabout of $63 million US. It follows a group of friends who were haunted by the ghosts of one of their dead peers as they all engage in a video Skype call. Another film was Ouija, which had a budget between $5 to $8 million and made over $103 million US in the box office. It also has ghosts in its story, in which a group of friends are haunted by and killed by a ghost that is released due to their messing with a spirit board. Both of these films and their trailers frame the ghosts as antagonists, and their groups of characters are between the ages of 16 to 24. The films are also set in a modern time, which is different than Crimson Peak. These films were marketed similarly to Crimson Peak, with jump scares and ambient sounds used in their trailers in order to bring up tension, then using quick cuts in order to communicate it more. Unfriended also falls into the same rhythm as Ouija of using extra sounds to make a jump scare, quick editing, and musical choices that try to increase tension. Like Crimson Peak, this music doesn't necessarily belong in the score, especially because the style of Unfriended is somewhat of found footage. As I mentioned earlier, Crimson Peak is a gothic romance. Del Toro actually said that he was inspired by the works of Jane Eyre and Edgar Allan Poe, which is incredibly evident in the fact that there are a lot of similarities between Edgar Allan Poe's The House of the Fall of Usher and the film itself. Both The Fall of the House of Usher and Crimson Peak feature first-person narration from their protagonists, and both their protagonists are writers. They also go to the house of someone that they realize they didn't know as well as they may have thought. The Sharp siblings and the Usher twins are very similar as well, as they're both the last of their bloodlines and share the same home that they grew up in. Roderick Usher and Thomas Sharp share visual appearances as well, as Poe writes that Roderick has lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surpassingly beautiful curve, a finely molded chin, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. And while Lucille and Thomas aren't twins, Thomas's name does derive from the Greek word for twin. Madeline Usher's role is not as major as Lucille's, but both have an apathy for their brother's guests and engage in an incestuous relationship with said brother. Lucille is not ill or presumed to be dead, however, she does share Madeline's burial in her home, isolated from everyone but her brother on the daily up until Edith arrives, as well as the fact that Allerdale Hall is continuously sinking into the clay. Though Madeline ends up not being a ghost, her commotion is heard as the banging of pipes and walls. She has a physical presence in the home even if she's not physically present. The ghosts of Crimson Peak often pull or push on doors, interact with objects or characters physically, and have a sense of weight to their movements. As with the House of Usher, the architecture of Allerdale Hall is gothic in nature. It is visually inspired in part by the home from Edward Hopper's painting, The House by the Railroad. With its steep gables, tall narrow windows, and elaborate chimneys, it is an amalgamation of many real Gothic Revival homes and some artistic interpretation. Like in Poe's story, this house is set on an expanse of barren, dead land without any much greenery, aside from some scraggly trees. As the film progresses, red clay from the mines leaches up into the snow to create a striking visual that explains the nickname the property has of Crimson Peak. In The Fall of the House of Usher, Roderick and the narrator observe a brightly colored gas covering the property, which the narrator assures has a natural explanation as well. Allerdale Hall is a much more dilapidated home than that of House Usher, as the narrator makes note that the only true flaw there is a single crack, though it complements how the film is much more escalated in its storytelling. Crimson Peak is much more forward with its displays of the taboo and the inappropriate. Thomas and Lucille's relationship is revealed after they're caught in an extremely intimate and sexual embrace, much more beyond the sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature that Poe hints at. And their child that was admittedly killed by Lucille is shown and heard as a small ghost. Edith also receives some of the genre nonconformity, as in most Gothic romances, the female character lacks agency and seems extremely naive and virginal. While Edith is naive in the beginning of the film, she has her own sense of agency and initially writes off Thomas Sharp as a parasite with a title, not taking interest in him until he genuinely discusses her writing with her. To challenge the idea that a Gothic romance heroine must be virginal, Edith is shown to have sex with Thomas. This departure from the genre's rules is driven even further by the fact that they're in a position where Edith is on top and Thomas is beneath her, as traditionally a partner will be seen as submissive if they're beneath the other partner, regardless of the fact of whether they're giving or receiving. Edith is allowed to have control and a sense of sexuality, something that's not afforded to other female protagonists of this genre. At the end of The Fall of the House of Usher, Madeline uses the last of her strength to appear at the door of the room Roderick and the narrator are in order to kill her brother before she herself dies. The narrator flees out of the house in terror just in time to watch the house crumble to the ground, with both the siblings dead inside of it. Similarly, Lucille kills Thomas in a fit of jealousy, and while it doesn't kill her physically, it does kill her spiritually and emotionally. From this point on in the film, she takes on the behavior of a ghost. It's especially helped by the fact that her gown flows behind her ethereally. The majority of her dialogue is screaming, wailing, and growling. The film diverges further from The Fall of the House of Usher as Lucille and Edith eventually fight outside. Lucille actually mirrors an earlier jump scare here, as if she's also a ghost. She disappears seemingly without a trace, and as Edith's back is turned, she runs behind her very quickly. Unlike the narrator of The Fall of the House of Usher, Edith physically fights with Lucille and kills her. What further sets this film apart from other Gothic romances is that Del Toro adds his personal famous touch of allowing the monster to be sympathetic with the audience. Though Thomas is complicit in the murders of his wives, his mother, and Edith's father, he does love Edith and doesn't want her to die. He's truly fallen in love with her, and she him, even though she knows what he has done. Even Lucille has a sort of sympathy about her, volunteering herself for their mother's abuse to protect Thomas, taking care of that same woman when their father beat her, and wanting to take care of the child she and Thomas conceived, only to have to end its life with a mercy killing. Del Toro marries this sympathy with horror in a way that truly defines Gothic romance. In a powerful line of dialogue between Edith and Lucille, Edith asks,
"All this horror, for what? The money? To keep the mansion? The sharp name, the mines?"
And Lucille replies,
"The marriages were for money, of course. But the horror was for love. The things we do for love like this are ugly, mad, full of sweat and regret. This love burns you and maims you, twists you inside out. It is a monstrous love. And it makes monsters of